James I of Scotland ruled as king from 1406 to 1437. In 1406, the future king was captured by pirates and then imprisoned by Henry IV of England, a confinement that lasted for 18 years. He succeeded his father, Robert III of Scotland, but in James' absence, Scotland was ruled by his uncle, the Duke of Albany. James finally returned to Scotland in 1424, but his harsh treatment of the nobility, unpopular fiscal policies, and a failed siege of Roxburgh Castle culminated in his assassination in 1437, nevertheless, succeeded by his son, James II of Scotland, who continued the royal Stuart line. James was born on the 25th of July 1394, Palace, into the royal House of Stuart, which had been founded by Robert II of Scotland and which continued with Robert III of Scotland. James' father, Robert III, had been incapacitated in a riding accident in 1388, and so the daily governance of the kingdom was taken over by his brother, Robert, Earl of Fife. Scotland was at this time torn by the bitter rivalries which had been created by Robert II's wholesale land and title redistributions and his large number of competing offspring. In 1399, a royal council elected Robert III's son, David, as the king's lieutenant. This move only increased the crisis, and the Duke of Albany took radical action in March 1402. Imprisoning his nephew and leaving him to starve to death, Albany declared himself regent, and Robert III, fearing for the future of his kingdom and young son James, sent the 11-year-old prince to find safety in France. Unfortunately, the escape plan went badly wrong. Prince James was captured after the Hanseatic ship in which he was travelling to France was taken by pirates and wrecked on the east coast of England off head-on the 22nd of March 1406. The prince was captured and presented to the king for a suitable fee. Henry IV of England then imprisoned his fellow royal in such residences as Windsor Castle, the Tower of London, and Nottingham Castle. Henry demanded a huge ransom for James' release, but his father had died shortly after his capture, and so even if James did officially become king, nobody was forthcoming with the cash, least of all the Duke of Albany, who remained regent until his death in September 1420. The Duke, in contrast, had managed in 1416 to secure the release of his own son, Murdoch Stuart, who was likewise languishing in an English prison. Murdoch succeeded his father as the regent in 1420. At least, the king's confinement was a comfortable one, and in the meantime, the two countries maintained an uneasy truce. Diplomatic relations were furthered when James married Lady Joan, a niece of Henry IV and daughter of the Earl of Somerset, in February 1424. The couple would have 8 children, although 6 were girls and only 1 boy. James survived infancy. The imprisoned king was near the end of his ordeal, but he still had plenty of time at his disposal to write a 379-line poem in praise of his wife's beauty, the King Esquire. Although a poem on courtly love, it does contain some passages which reflect the king's thoughts on his confinement, such as, "The bird, the beast, the fish eke in the sea. They live in freedom, each one in his kind. And I a man, and lacketh liberty. What shall I say? What reason may I find, that fortune should do so? Thus, in my mind me case, I would argue, but all for naught. There was no one to give my woes a thought." The king had also honed his skills in music, archery, wrestling, and medieval jousting during his captivity. Indeed, the king's martial skills had been put to good use by Henry V of England, who used James in his campaigns in France in 1420 during the 100 Years' War. The pair must have got on, as Henry knighted James and invited him to join the prestigious and highly select chivalric Order of the Garter in April 1421. James finally returned to Scotland in April 1424 after his ransom of £40,000, to be paid in instalments, was agreed upon. As part of the deal, 27 Scottish nobles were handed over to the English as hostages until the ransom was fully paid up. The king was crowned in May, and he was not slow to avenge his nobles' lack of enthusiasm in paying his ransom and securing his release much earlier. The Duke of Albany had escaped James' wrath, but his family did not, and many were executed, including Murdoch Stewart in May 1425. A general purge of disloyal officials and selected clan leaders followed. The Highland clans were brought further under royal control, notably the MacDonalds. James then set about systematically dispossessing ULs of their earldoms, so that he eventually controlled a great many of them himself. The king did not let the general populace off lightly either. Taxes were raised, fishing was prohibited out of season, rules were made as to what kinds of clothes certain classes could wear, and oddly enough, football was banned. The king did improve local justice and widened the membership of Parliament to include lesser nobles. Parliament also became a legislative body along the lines of the English version, regularly passing statute laws. Many of these new laws, as noted, imposed petty restrictions on everyday life, and many of them, too, were entirely unenforceable, such as one ruling that all rooks' nests should be removed from trees. Further, these legislative developments did not impress the lawless nobles, who had been enjoying full independence during the king's confinement. James pressed on regardless and entrenched the Stuarts as the great ruling family with a splendid round of spending on public projects and palaces such as at Linlithgow with its new Great Hall. In terms of foreign policy, James paid mere lip service to his treaty commitments with France, largely preferring instead to leave England and that kingdom to squabble amongst themselves on the continent. Diplomatic ties were strengthened with France when James promised his daughter Margaret in marriage to Louis, heir to the French throne, in 1436. There was one military dalliance in August 1436, and this was in a siege of Roxburgh Castle, still held by the English. James only succeeded in having his train of new cannons captured, an expensive and humiliating loss. Perhaps not surprisingly, with all this reshuffling and reassertion of royal power, many in the kingdom rather wished their king was still in the Tower of London. Few wished to see an escalating war with England, and Parliament refused the king's attempt to raise taxes. James was accused of enjoying too lavish a lifestyle at court, his easy living all too evident in his burgeoning physique. Described by one chronicler as thick-set and oppressed by too much fat. In trying to imitate the courts of England and France, James spent prodigious sums on fine clothes, jewellery, and furnishings. Only the first 2 ransom instalments to the English crown were paid, and so a major justification for the high taxes was absent. Even when James did finally persuade Parliament to levy a new tax in 1431, the condition attached was that the revenue must be kept in a strong box, which the king could not access for his own spending sprees. The Scots' patience with their extravagant and authoritarian king was fast running out. The final straw may have been James' formal decision to stop paying the ransom altogether. Even if several Scottish nobles were being held hostage, a small group of radical barons, some of whose heirs were hostages, were determined on action, and, led by Walter, Earl of Athol, the king's uncle, they conspired to arrest the king in Parliament. When this strategy failed, more drastic action was taken. The king was assassinated in the monastery of Friars Preachers in Perth on the 21st of February 1437. In one version of the confused events, a lady tried to block the door to the king's chambers using only her arm, which was then broken. The king escaped into the sewers, but was discovered by his assassins. and stabbed to death. Queen Joan was present and just managed to escape, although she was herself wounded in the episode. Unforeseen by the king's murderers, the nobility rallied around Queen Joan and her young son James. Regicide, it seemed, remained an unforgivable crime, no matter how despised the monarch. The assassins of James I were rounded up, tortured, and executed. One of them was said to have had a burning hot iron crown placed on his head. James Ida died aged 43, and he was buried in the Carthusian Priory of Perth. He was succeeded by his son James, who became James II of Scotland. The new king was still a minor, and so there followed the all-too-familiar pattern of nobles jostling for control of the king and his kingdom. Intrigues, murders, and executions were followed by a civil war between the Douglases and those families loyal to the crown. James II won that war, but was killed in 1460 when the cannon he was standing next to exploded during a siege of Roxburgh Castle. It seems the Stuart kings were either accident-prone or terribly unlucky. But the line continued through the remainder of the medieval period and beyond, when James VI of Scotland became James I of England, unifying the two kingdoms under a single monarch. James II of Scotland ruled as king from 1437 to 1460, succeeding his murdered father James I of Scotland. James inherited the throne as a child. The first part of his reign witnessed intense rivalries between rival barons, which sent Scotland into a civil war. The young king was nicknamed Fiery Face because of a prominent birthmark on his face. From 1449, James reached maturity and began to take control of his kingdom, and he skillfully fostered allies, reduced the wealth and power of rival families, and championed new military technology. Having eliminated all rivals and made several attacks on northern England, the king died aged just 29 in August 1460 when a cannon he was standing next to exploded. He was succeeded by his son James III of Scotland. James I had spent 18 years confined by the kings of England before he returned to Scotland in 1424. The king shook up the nobility of Scotland, punishing those who had been disloyal in his absence, and reshaping the estates, titles, and particularly earldoms that had been in place for centuries. The monarch was autocratic and lived an extravagant lifestyle. Unpopular taxes and a humiliating failure to take Roxburgh Castle in 1436 added to the and the king was assassinated in Perth in February of the next year. James I's only son was born on the 16th of October 1430 in Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh and named after his father. Actually, there were twins, but the other boy, named Alexander, did not survive infancy. James Jr. gained the nickname Fiery Face because of a large birthmark which covered the left side of his face, although he also became known for his fiery temper, too. Prince James' mother was Lady Joan Bodley, a niece of Henry IV of England and daughter of the Earl of Somerset. Fortunately for Joan and Prince James, most of the nobility did not side with the murderers of James II, and so the Stuart line continued to rule Scotland. Succeeding on the 21st of February 1437, James II was crowned on the 26th of March in Holyrood, and not in the traditional site of Scone Abbey because of fears for the king's safety so far from the capital. James was only 6 years old, and he would certainly have his work cut out to keep control of his kingdom. In the first instance, Earl Archibald Douglas, as James' closest adult male relative, became the king's lieutenant general or regent, and all was well. However, when Archibald died of a plague in June 1439, rivalries broke out between nobles, the Queen, and her second husband, the nobleman James Stuart, and within the Douglas clan itself. As one historian notes, documentary evidence for the 1440s is scanty, lending weight to the view that this was a time of turmoil. Over the next decade, three families in particular were a source of endless rivalries and shifting allegiance: the Crichtons, the Douglas Earls, and their wide network of family connections, and the Livingstons, who had entrenched themselves in the kingdom's administrative offices and who also controlled Stirling Castle. There were murders and executions on all sides. Then Queen Joan died in 1445. James' reign was about to get back on track, though, and the first step was on 3 July 1449, when he married the Burgundian noblewoman Mary of Guelders, daughter of the Duke of Guelders and niece of Philip the Good, the immensely powerful Duke of Burgundy. Not only did this union help trade relations with the Low Countries, but the king also acquired from Burgundy a useful number of cannons, including, perhaps, the famous Mongs Meg, a giant cannon now on display in Edinburgh Castle. In 1449, James reached maturity and wasted no time dealing with his cantankerous nobles. He stripped the Livingstons of much of their revenue-generating titles. But the chief threat was the Black Douglases, who controlled 3 earldoms outright, and insisted they had a legitimate claim to a 4th. The king took advantage of Earl William Douglas' pilgrimage to Rome in the autumn of 1450 to begin harassing Douglas lands and seizing key castles. The decisive moment in James' reign came in February 1452. When James invited William Douglas to Stirling Castle, the Earl was promised safe conduct, but the king, suspecting him of making treasonable alliances with a number of northern barons, got into a heated argument and stabbed him in the neck. His courtiers then finished off the Earl. One medieval chronicler recorded that the Earl's body had 26 stab wounds. Parliaments absolved the king of any intention to kill the Earl in June 1452. But a civil war followed anyway, between the Black Douglases and those nobles loyal to the king. James put his cannons to good use, and finally won the war 3 years later with the decisive Battle of Arkenholm and the capture of the last Douglas stronghold, Thrieve Castle. Senior members of the Douglas family were killed in action, executed, or exiled, and their estates were confiscated and redistributed to the king's 2 sons, John and Alexander. Apart from finally creating peace in his kingdom, James' other achievements included centralizing his government, making the justice system more effective, increasing royal control over church appointments, and founding a new university in Glasgow in 1451. The king also took advantage of the disruption caused by the Civil War in England, now known as the Wars of the Roses, to attack lands on the other side of his southern border. Now that the Douglases had been put in their place, James could concentrate on using his armies outside Scotland. Notable targets were Berwick in 1455 and 1457, and the Isle of Man in 1456. None of these attacks was particularly successful, even if Northumberland was plundered, and a series of truces followed between the two countries. At the end of July 1460, James, still very much enamoured with artillery and back on the warpath, laid siege to Roxburgh Castle, a mighty fortress that had seen a Stuart king come a cropper in the past. On the 3rd of August, standing next to one mighty cannon, the king was killed when it exploded, and a huge piece of iron sliced through his thigh bone. Ironically, the cannon was not even fired in anger, but had been set off as a salute to the arrival of the Queen at the siege, invited there by the king. Such was his confidence in victory. At least Queen Mary pressed on with the siege, and brought it to a successful conclusion 5 days later. James II was then buried at home. Following his father's death, the king's eldest son James became James III of Scotland. He was only 8 years old, and so his mother, Queen Mary, took charge of the kingdom. The Queen died in 1463, and this was the opportunity for ambitious nobles to stake their claim to the throne. James III was effectively kidnapped while out hunting by the courtiers Alexander and Robert Boyd. The Boyd brothers even convinced their captive to marry the daughter of the King of Norway. When James reached maturity in 1469, the Boyd brothers got their comeuppance, and they were tried and found guilty of treason. Robert managed to escape to England, but Alexander was executed. The king would yet suffer another kidnapping, and the Scottish nobles once again squabbled for ultimate power. James III was killed in 1488, possibly by accident after a skirmish. The Stuarts were nothing if not resilient, though, and the line continued with James' son, who became James IV of Scotland. James III of Scotland reigned as king from 1460 to 1488. He succeeded his father, James II of Scotland, at the age of 8, which led to some nobles taking advantage of the king's minority and even abducting him. James was also challenged by his two brothers, and again by his eldest son during a thoroughly unpopular reign which saw high taxes and systematic marginalization of the nobility. James was killed in a skirmish with rebels in June 1488. The royal Stuart line continued with James' eldest son, who became James IV of Scotland. James II had established strong royal control over the kingdom by eliminating or marginalizing such powerful families as the Douglases. The king even felt confident enough to attack northern England with several major campaigns through the 1450s. James' elder son, yet another James, was born in May 1452. His mother was Mary of daughter of the Duke of Guelders and niece of Philip the Good, the immensely powerful Duke of Burgundy. Tragedy struck the royal family when the king died in an accident on the 3rd of August 1460. James II had been attacking Roxburgh Castle, then garrisoned by the English, and the cannon he was standing next to had exploded. He was 29 years old. Consequently, Prince James was only 8 years old when he became James III of Scotland. The boy king was crowned on the 10th of August at Kelso Abbey. Queen Mary ruled as her son's regent with success, not only completing the siege of Roxburgh Castle, but even managing to get back control of Berwick, a much disputed property between Scotland and England. Mary had negotiated with Henry VI of England to receive Berwick in March 1461 in return for shelter, as the king was just then fighting his own civil war during the dynastic conflict, now known as the Wars of the Roses. Mary also greatly improved Falkland Palace and built Ravenscraig Castle in which had battlements designed to accommodate the cannons, which were fast becoming a necessity in warfare. The Queen was known for her piety, and she founded Holy Trinity Church in Edinburgh, the altarpiece for which was provided by the Flemish artist Hugo van der Goes, with painted panels showing James III and his Queen. Unfortunately, Queen Mary's regency was brief, as she died in December 1463, and James Kennedy, Bishop of St. Andrews, then became the king's guardian. In 1464, he ensured the young James went on to tours of his kingdom to foster grassroots support for the monarchy. Bishop Kennedy died in May 1465, which presented a long-awaited opportunity for ambitious nobles to improve their own positions at the expense of the crown. On the 9th of July 1466, James III was kidnapped while out hunting by the courtiers Alexander and Robert Boyd of Kilmarnock. The Boyd brothers forced the king to pretend he was not being held against his will. Robert Boyd, the elder brother, then took the lead, sidelining Alexander and making his own son Thomas, the Earl of Arran. Thomas was also betrothed to Mary, the king's elder sister. Robert Boyd even convinced James to marry Margaret of Denmark, the daughter of the King of Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. The marriage took place on the 13th of July 1469, and the union would ultimately give Scotland the long sought-after control of the Orkney and Shetland Isles. Robert Boyd, meanwhile, declared himself the guardian of Scotland and took over the office of King's Chamberlain. When James reached maturity in 1469, both Boyd brothers got their comeuppance, and they were tried and found guilty of treason. Robert and his son managed to escape to England, but Alexander was executed. The king was intent on increasing royal power at any cost, a policy symbolized by his adoption of the closed imperial crown symbol and his wide application of the treasonous offense of insulting the king to include any action James considered an impediment to his will. Nobles were neglected in favor of administrators and clerics. Edinburgh became the great bureaucratic center of government, even if the reality was that Scotland remained a kingdom that depended on its regional barons to enforce government policies across the realm. The king, however, made no effort whatsoever to visit any part of his kingdom outside the capital. In 1474, the king arranged for his eldest son and heir, James B. 1473, to marry Cecily, the daughter of Edward IV of England. James III's pro-English stance, high taxes, and unscrupulous sale of royal pardons for cash were additional factors in his distinct lack of popularity, not only amongst his nobles, but even his own family. The king's preoccupation with music, the arts, and alchemy became rather too much for some barons. However, to nip any rebellion in the bud, James had his two younger brothers, John, Earl of Mar, and Alexander, Duke of Albany, imprisoned in 1479. John died in confinement in mysterious circumstances, seemingly bleeding to death while taking a bath. Alexander, meanwhile, escaped to the safety of France, but he would be back soon enough to stake his own claim for the throne. These developments did nothing to appease the Scottish nobles, who were becoming increasingly alarmed at the king's autocracy and his preference for low-class company. Many nobles were not best pleased to see the likes of William Sheaves, a former servant who once sewed the king's shorts, be given control of the Archbishopric of St. Andrews. James' decision to debase the currency in 1479–80, which gave him personally plenty of silver but devastated trade, may have been the last straw. The coins might have been of questionable value, but they are historically significant as the first medieval coins minted north of the Alps that show a king's portrait. In July 1482, perhaps not surprisingly, the king was kidnapped for a second time, this time by a group of disaffected nobles with Alexander Stuart as their Alexander schemed with Edward IV in England to usurp his brother. An English army, jointly led by Alexander and Edward's brother, invaded Scotland, the first to do so since 1400. James was captured at Lauder, north of Melrose, and he was lucky to escape with his life, a fate not enjoyed by two of his entourage. The king was then imprisoned in Edinburgh Castle. It may have been the rebels' intention to make Alexander the king's regent. Edward IV saw a golden opportunity to regain control of Bir. As it turned out, the invading army went unchallenged, and the revolution fizzled out through lack of focus and leadership. English support also vanished with the death of Edward IV in April 1483, and not for the first time, Scottish nobles balked at the idea of murdering their king. James was released, and a fragile suspension of hostilities followed. The respite in Scotland's turbulent politics was brief. In July 1484, a small English-Scottish force, led by the Earl of Angus, the senior member of the powerful Red Douglas family, once again tried to put Alexander on the throne. Royalists defeated this force at Lochmaban on the 22nd of July, where the Earl of Angus was captured. Once again, Alexander fled south, unwisely returning the next year. Alexander was captured and held in Edinburgh Castle until he somehow managed to escape again to France. The man who would be king was then killed in a bizarre accident in a medieval tournament in Paris, struck by a flying shard from a lance, as he watched the proceedings from the stands. Meanwhile, King James seemed unable to comprehend the connection between his harsh policies and disaffected nobility. The king carried on just as he always had, dismissing capable officials, appointing unpopular ones, and persecuting anyone he thought remotely In February 1488, yet another attack on the king came, this time involving his son James, who declared himself the Prince of Scotland. Initially, the northern barons were loyal to the crown, but James Jr. had the support of the Earl of Argyll. The two sides met in a battle at Stirling that is better described as a skirmish. Small in scale, perhaps, the fate of Scotland hung on its outcome. On the 11th of June 1488, the small force, led by the king, was defeated by the rebels at Sorcheborne near Bannockburn Field. James III was carrying the great sword of Scotland's hero Robert the Bruce, but it did not do him any good. Attempting to escape the wrath of the victors, the king was killed, perhaps unintentionally or, in other versions, by an enemy disguised as a priest. His son James became James IV of Scotland, and he was struck with remorse for stirring up the trouble that had claimed the life of his father. The new king was said to have worn an iron chain around his waist, each lent thereafter as a penance for his role in the regicide. James III was buried in Cambuskenneth Abbey, next to Queen Margaret, who had died 2 years before. James IV was only 15 when he took the throne, but he developed into a popular king with his interest in applying justice in every corner of his realm, the development of Scotland's first navy, and his promotion of such innovations as the printing press. Relations with England started brightly with his marriage to Margaret Tudor, daughter of Henry VII of England, but then deteriorated into warfare during the reign of Henry VIII of England. James IV ruled Scotland until 1513, when he was killed in battle against the English, and so was succeeded by his son, James V of Scotland. James IV of Scotland ruled as king from 1488 to 1513. He succeeded his father James III of Scotland, and became one of the most popular of the Stuart kings. James sought to apply justice in every corner of his realm. He created Scotland's first navy, and he promoted such innovations as the printing press. The royal houses of England and Scotland were joined in 1503 when James married Margaret Tudor, daughter of Henry VII of England. James IV was killed, along with the flower of Scotland's nobility, when he lost the Battle of Flodden against the English in September 1513. He was succeeded by his son, James V of Scotland, and so the royal Stuart line continued. James III of Scotland was one of the most unpopular kings the country had ever seen, alienating the nobility, his brothers, and eventually even his own son and heir. The king was twice abducted and then killed during a skirmish in June 1488. The last episode had seen rebel barons, led by the Earl of Argyll, attempt to promote James III's eldest son, also called James, as king. Struck with remorse for his role in his father's demise, James was said to have worn an iron chain around his waist, each lent thereafter as a penance. Nevertheless, he succeeded his father and became James IV of Scotland, continuing the line of stewards on the throne that had begun with Robert II of Scotland. James IV was born on the 17th of March, 1473, and so he was only 15 when he succeeded his father and became king. His coronation was held at Scone Abbey on the 26th of June, 1488, but it was not until several years of political jostling amongst the nobility had played themselves out that he could rule Scotland in his own right. That is from around 1495. James' mother was Margaret of Denmark, who had died in 1486. Back in 1474, James III had arranged for his eldest son to marry Cecily, the daughter of Edward IV of England. But this never came about, as Edward IV died and the long dynastic dispute known as the Wars of the Roses continued to destabilize England. Henry Tudor won those wars and established the royal house of Tudor with himself as its first king, Henry VII of England. Relations between Scotland and England became more friendly than usual when James married Margaret Tudor, Henry VII's daughter. On the 8th of August 1503, the couple's union was described by the acclaimed contemporary poet William Dunbar as the marriage of the thistle and a rose, and their one surviving child, also called James, was born in 1512. James IV cut a dashing figure thanks to his height, good looks, and interest in chivalry and associated pursuits like hunting, falconry, archery, and jousting. The king was intelligent, spoke 7 languages, and was interested in innovations. For example, the king had a personal collection of 5 handguns. A fleet of warships was built from 1500 to some with French aid, and so Scotland's first navy was created, which provided a useful defence against piracy in the North Sea and protection for the coast of Lothian, a favourite target of English ships in the late Middle Ages. Amongst the ships was the Great Michael, launched in October 1511, and then the largest active warship in Europe. James took a keen interest in chemistry, alchemy, and dentistry, often practicing these himself. In Aberdeen, the king created the first department of medicine in a British university in 1495 and founded the Surgeon S. College in Edinburgh. 1507 saw James introduce to Scotland its first printing press. Not always successful in his schemes, one close collaborator was encouraged to try and fly off the battlements of Stirling Castle, but his mechanical wings came unstuck, and he landed in a pile of manure. There were some unpopular decisions, too, like the 1491 laws, which banned football and golf because it was felt that too many people were playing these sports and not practicing archery, then considered important for warfare. In true Renaissance fashion, James was a great patron of the arts, supporting musicians, poets, and artists at his court, which became renowned for its spectacles and pageants. In contrast, the king had a reputation for keeping company with prostitutes, and he fathered many illegitimate children, many of whom were raised alongside his legitimate offspring in Stirling Castle. James consolidated the control of the crown over all parts of Scotland, by now pretty well established, but there were still some pockets of independence. The king travelled widely across Scotland, making himself visible to his subjects. In this way, he could resolve important family disputes in person and ensure that justice was done in his local courts. The king also performed a number of pilgrimages within Scotland. James was loyal and generous to those families that had helped him in his troubles with his father. Additionally, the king made sure his royal council evenly represented the noble families of Scotland. As a consequence of these policies, the heart of his kingdom was largely stable and peaceful throughout his reign. Several military expeditions in the 1490s brought the lords of the Isles in the far north better under control, particularly the troublesome MacDonalds. The Scottish Highlands, also wild and remote, had always been a source of trouble for Scottish monarchs, and here James relied on the Campbell and Gordon clans to govern in his name. Elsewhere, clan leaders were now held accountable for the actions of their clansmen. State revenues tripled during James' reign, thanks to his efficient application of feudal laws when estates changed hands, and the imposition of taxes on the clergy. The king was thus able to spend freely on significant building projects, like the new palace at a palace at Falkirk, a new royal chapel at Stirling Castle, and a new great hall for Edinburgh Castle. Many of these buildings included the latest ideas in Renaissance architecture, further enhancing the king's reputation as a man of new ideas and a monarch who was moving Scotland from the medieval world into that of the early modern. James' foreign policy included intervention in the civil war in Denmark in 1501–2. The king, no doubt influenced by his mother's connections there. It was the volatile relations with England, though, that defined James IV's reign. In 1495–97, James hosted the pretender to the English throne, Perkin Warbeck, and raided northern England several times, using Warbeck as a front. In November 1499, Warbeck confessed that he was an impostor with no royal blood, and he was executed. Peace was then established with England, thanks to James' marriage. But, unfortunately, this happy state would not survive Henry VII's death in 1509. The most significant consequence of the marriage, which neither monarchy seemed all that enthusiastic about, would come much later when in 1603, James' great-grandson James VI of Scotland was invited to become the King of England, and so the two crowns were unified. The next king south of the border, Henry VIII of England, was ambitious to be seen as a powerful Renaissance prince in European circles, and he set his sights on France, which he invaded in 1513. Aware of this threat, the French had renewed the alliance with Scotland, their traditional allies. The year before, as part of this treaty, James was given supplies of timber and a number of shipwrights with which to extend his navy. A force of 13 ships and 4,000 men was then sent to Normandy to aid Louis XII of France. As it turned out, the fleet was beset with bad weather, failed to link up with the Breton and French fleets, and the great Michael even suffered the ignominy of running aground. Nevertheless, the support for Louis XII made it abundantly clear that the Scottish king did not put much value on his 1502 peace treaty with England, which his marriage had only flimsily sealed. As part of his agreement with France, James was obliged to attack England on land, which he did with an army numbering some 20,000 men. There were early successes, such as the capture of Norham Walk, Ettal, and Ford castles. However, the Scots army was ill-equipped and unpaid, so that it was no match for its opposition. Even if it did have a number of cannons commandeered from Edinburgh Castle, the English army, led by the Earl of Surrey, met the Scottish force, by now depleted by illness and desertions, but still significant in size. On the 9th of September 1513 the English managed to tempt the Scottish forces down from the safety of Flodden Hill, and, in treacherous conditions of wind, rain, and thick mud, they won a resounding victory. James IV was killed, along with some 10,000 Scots. The English, in stark contrast, lost only 1,500 men. Perhaps more significantly for the management of the kingdom, Scotland also lost a huge slice of its nobility. Amongst the dead were 9 earls, 14 barons, and 3 bishops, not to mention the king, of course. James' body was embalmed and sent to Berwick, and then possibly to London, but its ultimate fate is not known for certain. The king's eldest son James thus became James V of Scotland, but he was only 1 year old at the time. During the king's minority, his mother, Queen Margaret, remarried in 1514 to the Earl of Angus, and had to battle with John Stuart, the Duke of Albany and grandson of James II of Scotland, for the regency. Reaching maturity, James V married twice, both his queens being French, Madeleine de Valois, daughter of Francis I of France, and then Mary of Guise. The king did his popularity no good whatsoever, with his policy of high taxes and attacks on the nobility. Most infamously, the sister of the Earl of Angus, who was burnt at the stake. Henry VIII then attacked Scotland in force and won another resounding victory, this time at Solway Moss in November 1542. James V died within a month of the loss, with no male heirs. James' daughter with Mary of Guise, Mary, Queen of Scots, inherited the throne, and, as she also became Queen of France, the conflict with the Tudors in England rolled on. James V of Scotland ruled as king from 1513 to 1542. He succeeded his father, James IV of Scotland, one of the country's most popular Stuart kings. But, as he was still a child, the early part of his reign was tempestuous. with his mother and nobles battling for control of the regency. Ruling in his own right from 1528, the king's fiscal policies were unpopular, and his decision to forge closer ties with France through his marriages, first to the daughter of Francis I of France, and then to Mary of Guise, divided his kingdom. James died of illness within a month of a military defeat at the hands of an English army at Solway Moss in 1542. He was just 30 years of age. James V was succeeded by his infant daughter, Mary, Queen of Scots. James IV of Scotland had been one of the country's most popular kings, and certainly the most effective of the Stuart kings who had reigned since Robert II of Scotland. In August 1503, James had married Margaret Tudor, daughter of Henry VII of England, but relations between the two countries turned sour when war broke out between England and France during the reign of the next English, King Henry VIII of England. France expected Scotland, its ally by treaty, to invade northern England, and this is what James IV did in 1513. The expedition was a disaster, and Scotland's army was crushed at Flodden Hill on the 9th of September. James IV, 9 earls, and 14 barons were all killed, along with some 10,000 Scots. James V was born on the 10th of April 1512 in Linlithgow Palace. None of his 5 siblings survived infancy. The new king was, then, merely 17 months old when his father died, and so he needed a regent. Even if he was crowned king on the 21st of September 1513 at Stirling Castle, the position as the king's guardian was fought over between his mother Queen Margaret, who remarried in 1514 to Archibald Douglas, 6th Earl of Angus, and John Stuart, the Duke of Albany and grandson of James II of Scotland, with Margaret, sister of Henry VIII, involved in the regency. At least there was peace between England and Scotland. But when the Duke of Albany took over in July 1515, the government swung around to be pro-French again. When the Duke sailed to France in 1524 to cement diplomatic relations, the Queen seized the opportunity to retake the regency. The young James, meanwhile, blissfully pursued those pastimes expected to occupy a young noble: tennis, music, and jousting. The shenanigans at court continued, and eventually became more threatening for King James. From 1525 until 1528, the boy king was kept a virtual prisoner by the Earl of Angus, who had fallen out with Queen Margaret. The king was meant to be rotated every 3 months between different households to maintain some kind of balance in the fractious government, but the Earl of Angus refused to give him up. Finally escaping the clutches of his stepfather in May 1528, and still only 16 years old, James took over the government in his own right the next month. The nobility swore allegiance to their king, and the Earl of Angus was obliged to seek safety in exile. Reaching maturity, James V married twice, both his queens being French. The first marriage was to Madeleine de Valois, daughter of Francis I of France. It was arranged far in advance by the Duke of Albany under the Treaty of Rouen of 1517. The actual marriage took place on the 1st of January 1537 in Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, but, always having had frail health, Madeleine died of consumption 6 months later. On the 12th of June 1538, James married Mary of Guise, a member of a powerful and prominent Catholic family. The king was also known to have had many mistresses and fathered at least 9 illegitimate children. With Mary of Guise, James had one daughter, also called Mary, born on the 8th of December 1542. Perhaps, understandably, given his father's fate, James V pursued a foreign policy which was decidedly pro-French and anti-English. James visited France in 1536-7, and the king even failed to turn up to a proposed meeting with Henry VIII at York in September 1541 in order to discuss a peace deal. Meanwhile, at home, the Queen influenced the king to take a stance against Lutheran Protestants, a decision which blackened his reputation when later Protestant writers drew up their histories of Scotland. The king did his popularity no good whatsoever with his policies of high taxes, raising rents, confiscating estates, and general fleecing of the church. This grasping approach was designed to fill the holes in the Crown's finances, as James could only count on half the income his father had enjoyed. This was despite James receiving 2 generous dowries for his marriages, but was a consequence of the nobles helping themselves to the country's wealth while he had been a child. Big spending projects to renovate key palaces and castles were not helpful and necessitated more squeezing of the public purse. The king's standing sunk even further with his attacks on those in the nobility who had plotted against him during his minority, most infamously Lady Glen, the sister of the Earl of Angus, who was burnt at the stake in Edinburgh in 1537 on charges of treason. A suspicion of plots was perhaps understandable given the interminable manoeuvres of his regency years, and a legend grew. James stalked his realm in disguise, going by the name of the Tenant of Bel, to find out what nobles and commoners alike really thought of their king. Despite the problems with the Douglases, it seems relations with the nobility were no better and no worse than in other periods. The king may not have entirely trusted his ordinary subjects, as he spent a great deal of energy chasing after lawbreakers across his realm, and the College of Justice was established in 1532. On the other hand, one could argue this was the duty of a good king to protect his law-abiding citizens. James' deeds are difficult to determine objectively, since so many contemporary sources are either from an English viewpoint or Protestant writers eager to denigrate his daughter Mary and her relations for her support of Catholicism. As the Oxford Kings and Queens of Britain notes, James V has been called the most unpleasant of the stewards, an unwelcome victory in a fiercely competitive field. More recent work by 21st century historians, however, is revising this wholly negative view of James' reign. Certainly, the king's trip to France in 1536 for 7 months, when he left for nobles in charge of the kingdom, does suggest Scotland had finally achieved some political stability. Henry VIII eventually decided to take more direct action against his northern neighbour. Prior to his planned invasion of France, Henry sent the Duke of Norfolk to attack Scotland in force in 1542. Initially, the Scots held their own, and they were thus emboldened to launch a counter-strike, Solway Moss, on the Scottish border on the 24th of November 1542. As it turned out, this became a bad loss for the Scots, not in terms of casualties but because over 1,000 Scotsmen were taken as prisoners. James V then died within a month of Solway, on the 14th of December at Falkland Palace. The cause of death was a lingering fever, which had prevented the king from being present at the decisive battle. The king was buried at home, with no male heirs. 2 princes, James and Arthur, had both died in 1541. James' daughter with Mary of Guise. Mary inherited the throne and became known to history as Mary, Queen of Scots, as she also became Queen of France through marriage. The conflict with the Tudors in England rolled on. Mary was only 1 week old when she became queen, but when she reached maturity, she schemed to take the English throne from Henry VIII's daughter, Queen Elizabeth I of England. Mary was executed for her troubles, and her son became James VI of Scotland. When Elizabeth died without an heir, James VI was invited to become the King of England as James I, and so the Stuart line managed to unify the 2 crowns.